Darren Stewart mentioned a sweeper a little while ago. I really don't fully understand what a sweeper is, but I did play baseball, and I know what a cleanup hitter is. Yoram Dinstein is, in fact, our cleanup hitter. And Yoram, welcome back to the podium. I look forward to your closing remarks.
Well, I was going to start actually with sort of an encomium for Dennis, but to be honest, the dean stole my thunder yesterday, so I don't want to repeat it. Nevertheless, having been closely attached to this department one way or another since 1999, I do want to say, Dennis, that you've really put it on the map, and you can look back with pride and satisfaction on your record, and we all owe you a lot. Okay, now the subject. I shall deal with 5 issues. Obviously, it's been a very rich conference. I cannot come to grips with every single question that has arisen here. But 5 main issues deserve further attention. One is definition, one is thresholds, one is use in bello, one is intervention, and one is interaction. These are the 5. Let's start with definition. Conferences can confuse, they can deconfuse, they can do both. As far as the definitions are concerned, I've been confused. Actually, I realized right away when I stepped in that something is wrong, when I took a look at the logo and asked myself, non-international armed conflict, how do you exactly figure it out from this particular sinister picture? It's as relevant to non-international armed conflicts as it is to an attack by UFOs. You see these shining lights. And conceivably, since the other side of the base, you have here underwater warfare, this may be submarine warfare. You don't see the submarine, but that's because they're submerged. And you don't see the non-international armed conflict either. So I said to myself, maybe I should take a look at the globe. And it's interesting, usually when I talk to students, I say there are so many NIACs today, they are occurring everywhere. And usually a student will raise his hand and say, Prof, everywhere? And I would say, well, not in the Arctic Ocean. So, okay, the Arctic Ocean, the littoral. What do they expect? Apparently, the Chukchis in Siberia may start a non-international armed conflict, not to mention the Greenlanders against Denmark. But otherwise, okay, now, this all relates actually to what? To Hamdi. Before I came here, I have taken it for granted that Hamdi is an obstacle. I mean, it's no different from the War Powers Resolution. You've got the War Powers Resolution. Obviously, you are not going to pay any heed to it. So you employ the best and the brightest within the Beltway to come up with ingenious or disingenuous legal ways to go around it, to outflank it, to circumvent it. And you have all heard yesterday a brilliant presentation by Harold Coe doing precisely that. So I've assumed that the administration will do the same with Hamdi. Much to my surprise, I must say, it turns out that they have come actually to embrace Hamdi. They accept it. They accept the oxymoron of a global non-international armed conflict. Well, that is a surprise for me, but it's a fact of life. So the question is, what will it imply or indicate in terms of the future? And there are 2 possibilities. I'm not going to say never in any circumstances, which is NIAC 2. There are 2 possibilities. One is that the whole world will actually embrace Hamdi. As Bill Litzau reminded us, by quoting Oliver Wendell Holmes, the life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience. Mind you, Oliver Wendell Holmes said that about the common law in his book, so entitled, The Common Law. Yet, I do not deny that customary international law is similar to the common law, as distinct from treaty law, which is logical, just as statutes, lex scripta in general, are logical. Holmes did not speak about them. But customary international law, yes. So maybe it will happen. It has already happened. I want to remind you with the continental shelf in 1945, from way out in left field, President Truman threw into the international arena the phrase continental shelf, and within 10 years, it became customary international law. Logical? No, but a fact of life. But I doubt that this will be the case here, because I, for one, believe, I may be wrong, that other countries will treat it merely as a bizarre peculiarity of American constitutional law. It's no different from the distinction made in American constitutional law between treaties on the one hand and executive agreements on the other. So obviously in American law schools this is a big subject. Elsewhere on this planet, except perhaps the Arctic Ocean, we make short shrift of it. And we'll say, well, the Americans, you know, out there across the pond, they have their quaint approaches to law, and they call some treaties executive agreements. What can we do? From the viewpoint of international law, a treaty is a treaty is a treaty. The Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties says so explicitly. A treaty is a treaty no matter what designation it carries, and an executive agreement is a treaty. But since you do not regard it as a treaty from the viewpoint of American constitutional law, you do not submit it to the Senate for advice and consent. Okay? That, in my opinion, is what will happen with Hamdi. I do not see international lawyers outside of the United States being ready to accept this illogical idea that a non-international armed conflict can be fought globally, i.e. internationally. Now, what is the definition of a non-international armed conflict under present-day international law? It's very simple, and it's not at all controversial. A non-international armed conflict must take place within the borders of a single state with reflecting a conflict between the central government on the one hand and organized armed groups, which incidentally are, as we were reminded by Mike Schmidt, subdivided into two subgroups. One is dissident armed groups, that is to say, a part of the army that has shifted sides, or any group of civilians who are taking up arms for the first time and get organized. But anyhow, central government, organized armed groups. Another possibility is that the central government has disappeared completely, and therefore you have organized armed groups on both sides of the equation. But in any event, it must be within the borders of a single state. There may be a spillover effect to a neighboring country, and there may therefore be another NIAC within that second country, but under no circumstances, according to present-day international law, can there be a NIAC across your border. End of the matter. And nobody until Hamdi actually has expressed the slightest doubt that this is the definition. So we'll see. Definitions may change. So let me move from definition to thresholds. There are 3 thresholds today, which means that you have 4 situations, because there is one below and one above. The first threshold is between ordinary crime-ridden situation and an armed conflict. That's below the threshold. The first threshold being Common Article 3, the second threshold being Protocol 2, and the third threshold being IAC. Okay, now below the threshold, we have a clear-cut definition. It's important to remember. This is a 2001 amendment to Article 1 of the 1980 CCW, the Convention on Conventional Weapons. And it refers to, and I quote, situations of internal disturbances and tensions, such as riots, isolated and sporadic acts of violence, and other acts of similar nature, not being armed conflict. Again, this is beyond dispute customary international law. So that's below the threshold. Then comes the first threshold. Now, the first threshold, as I said before, is Common Article 3. The problem is that Common Article 3 does not define NIACs. It refers to a NIAC, doesn't define it. I should add here, because it's not been done by others, according to the International Court of Justice in Nicaragua in 1986, Common Article 3 today is customary international law as regards all armed conflicts, whether they are NIACs or IACs. But either way, there's no definition. Then comes Protocol 2. Protocol 2, and Dave Graham actually has reminded us of it, but let me read out to you the definition. It refers to dissident armed groups or other organized armed groups under responsible command, exercise such control over a part of its territory, the state's territory, as to enable them to carry out sustained and concerted military operations and to implement this protocol. That's a fairly high threshold. Now, the most important element of this definition is the control of territory. And you see also why it's so important. It is only the control of territory that enables the insurgents to actually implement Protocol 2. Otherwise, how do they do it exactly? If there are obligations about due process of law, where and how do you actually execute due process of law in the middle of the jungle while you are moving or perhaps you are on the run? You need control of territory. But coming back to threshold 1, again, as Dave Graham has reminded us, when in Tadic, the first judgment of the ICTY, the judges in the appeal chamber addressed the issue, they decided to introduce a new element. And they said, well, in order to meet the first threshold, the hostilities have to be protracted and intense. And to be honest, again, I thought that this solves the situation. But we now realize that it doesn't. It doesn't because of what's going on in the world in which we live today. Wolf von Heinig has reminded us of Mexico. What's going on in Mexico is certainly intense. It is definitely protracted. But is it a NIAC? According to the first, remember, this is the first, the lowest. Is this the case? And as I mentioned when I interjected during the debate, what about Syria today? More casualties than in Libya. It's certainly protracted, intense on the basis of the casualties. Nevertheless, is it a non-international armed conflict? And if it is not, why not? And therefore, it occurs to me that we have to borrow from Protocol 2 that element of control of some territory and to say, well, maybe you need control of some territory, not only for the second higher threshold, Protocol 2 threshold, but even for the lower Common Article 3, customary international law threshold, because without any control of territory, we do not know the difference between a NIAC on the one hand and ordinary violence on the other, a riot-type situation. Now, I'm offering to you merely on a tentative basis. I'm nonplussed like the rest of you by what's going on as we speak. I'm not sure about the answer, but it appears to me that this is a better answer than most that I've heard so far. Now, then comes, of course, the last threshold. The last threshold is IAC. And an IAC can develop into an IAC. I'll come back to it. In any event, we must always remember as we address the subject that we have to know where are we in terms of the thresholds. Let me just add by way of a footnote, because I'm old enough to have been a spectator in 1977. You should bear in mind, between 74 and 77, the conference, the diplomatic conference that took place, debated ad nauseum the issue of NIAC and came to no conclusion whatsoever. And 48 hours before the end, everybody took it for granted that there will be only one protocol on international armed conflicts. That the states gathered in Geneva could not come to any consensus about non-international armed conflicts. It was 24 hours before the end that the Canadian legal advisor, David Miller, decided to write down a text reflecting the lowest possible common denominator. He got the Pakistanis to agree, and a couple of African countries that didn't even know what the issues were, but it looked nice. Why did it look nice? Because it's the lowest possible common denominator. It doesn't say much, but it says more than Common Article 3, which is easy, since Common Article 3 says next to nothing. And AP2 was adopted. However, AP2 has hardly ever been applied in practice. Now it appears that in view of what's going on, there is new winds blowing. And that is attested, of course, by the Obama administration announcement of late that AP2 will be submitted to the Senate for advice and consent. Will they get the advice and consent? That's a different question. I want to remind you that the law of the Sea Convention has been submitted to the Senate for advice and consent, and we all know that what has happened. So who knows? But nevertheless, that's something new. There is some hope here. Although, once more, taking a look at the experience since 1977, let me tell you that states are always in denial. And the situation is as follows. If you are above the third threshold, you are in an NIAC, you say, no, this is not an NIAC, this is a NIAC. If you are between the first and the third, that is to say a NIAC either according to Common Article 3 or according to AP2, you say, no, this is not a NIAC, we are not in a NIAC. This is a situation of facing organized crime on a rather intense level. And if Charles doesn't mind my saying so, that was the situation of the UK in Northern Ireland. Because many people argued at the time, and would certainly argue today, that it ought to have been recognized as an NIAC. And de facto, so did the British government, because they started with the constabulary, but ultimately it was the army that had to put it down. Once you commit the army rather than the police, I don't think that there is any doubt about it. So it's typical. You always claim, and by you I mean a state, any state in the world, always claims that it's below the threshold which is appropriate. Yet, if AP2 will gain traction in the months and years ahead, maybe, hopefully, things will change. Okay, so now I want to refer to the jus in bello. There's no doubt again about it that there is a new trend of convergence between the jus in bello in IAC and in NIAC. But it must be stressed and re-stressed that there is no way, practically ever, although I always hesitate to say ever, who knows what will happen in a millennium. It's not likely, let's put it this way, that ever there will be a full convergence. There are at least three major obstacles. Obstacle one is the issue of POWs. In a NIAC, no matter how other countries are prepared to look upon the situation with some benign acceptance, the central government will always regard the insurgents as traitors. And if they are traitors, obviously they are not POWs. And therefore, in writing the Sanremo manual, we have accepted Charles's idea. You will notice the term combatants is not used at all. Instead, we are using the term fighters. Why fighters? Only in order to show that there is a difference between combatants in NIAC and those who resort to violence in the NIAC. We are not claiming that this is the best term. It's the best under the circumstances, better than any other term that we have heard. But the important thing to emphasize is the dichotomy. NIAC is not like IAC in this respect. Secondly, there is no neutrality. There cannot be neutrality in NIAC because there is only one state. Remember the definition. You can be neutral when you have at least two. You cannot be neutral when there is only one. As simple as that. There is no neutrality at all, whatsoever, in NIAC. Number three, there is no belligerent occupation. And there cannot be belligerent occupation. You cannot occupy your own land. And even when the government forces liberate some areas that had been taken over by the insurgents temporarily, that's not occupation. That's your own country, for God's sake. And as far as the insurgents are concerned, their claim is equal. They say, what are we fighting for? We are fighting to rid our country from the dirty hands of the central government. We are not occupying. We represent the people. It's we the people. So these three are indisputable, but there are others. I should mention blockade that was touched upon by Wolf. There is no blockade in NIAC. Or if you wish, there is blockade. But once there is blockade, by definition, it's not NIAC. This is the rule of international law. Once you impose blockade on the insurgents, you have thereby, by implication, bestowed upon them recognition as a belligerent party, which means that the rules, the jus in bello applicable, will not be that of NIAC, but that of IAC. That's the rule. Lots of cases about it, including American cases, incidentally. Then we've heard from Bill Boothby about the issue of weapons. The laws do not converge. And allow me to remind you a very interesting point that has arisen. In IAC, you have clearly a war crime of fighting in the uniform of the enemy. And the Skorzeny trial, which was mentioned by Dick Jackson, with all due respect, is neither here nor there for two reasons. Number two, because the court, which incidentally was an American military tribunal, not international, as he suggested. The court actually avoided the issue by saying that they didn't reach the point when they actually came into contact with the enemy. I don't buy that at all. In my opinion, Skorzeny has been overruled, and I do not know of any serious international lawyer today who has argued that Skorzeny should be followed. This is definitely a war crime. It's listed as such. You fight in enemy uniform, you're a war criminal. But there is no reciprocity in NIAC. Only one side is in uniform. The other is not in uniform. So what does it mean to fight in the uniform on the enemy when the enemy doesn't have a uniform? And therefore, this is the kind of rule that cannot apply in NIAC. And I can assure you, if we went into it very, very closely, as I hope we would, should there be a second edition of the Sanremo manual, we would find other cases in which NIAC cannot actually replicate IAC. Okay, the third issue, as I said before, is intervention. And this is a very important issue which was not, I think, covered fully in the conference. The question is, what do other countries do in terms of their response to the NIAC? And here the rules are basically clear, but the more experience we gain, the more we realize that there are question marks. The first basic rule is very simple. A foreign country can offer help to the central government against the insurgents. If it's doing that, or better still, if the central government asks for its help and it concedes, this does not change the situation from a NIAC into IAC. Although you have foreign troops fighting within the borders of another country. Why? Because there is a NIAC there between a central government and the insurgents, and the foreign troops merely lend help to the local armed forces in extinguishing, hopefully, the rebellion. But if you do the reverse, if the foreign government intervenes on behalf of the insurgents against the central government, that turns it immediately and automatically into an IAC. It's no longer an IAC. Why? Because you have the forces of two states pitted against each other. Once they are pitted against each other, by definition, you have an IAC, not an IAC. This is the basic rule, which is simple. But you see, the situation in Libya, for example, already shows that there is here a nice, how shall I put it, subtlety, a nuance. Several European countries have recognized the Benghazi authorities as the lawful new government of Libya. They did not say Libya has split into two parts, Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. Cyrenaica, it's Benghazi. Tripolitania, it's Gaddafi. That's a different matter. No, they said Benghazi represents the whole of Libya, including Tripolitania. Well, once you have made that statement, 5 minutes later, you can offer your military help to the new central government, i.e. Benghazi, and then it's no longer an IAC. We are participating in an IAC. We are helping the authorities in Benghazi to extinguish the rebellion against them by Gaddafi. That's, I must say, as a lawyer, I'm sure that you will all appreciate the subtlety of the approach. Okay, so here we have opportunities to, again, outflank the law. But with intervention, it's important to remember, once consent is withdrawn, and it can always be withdrawn, forget about it. You are not allowed to stay there for a minute longer. You can go there at the request of the local country, the local central government. I'm sorry, if there is no request by the central government says, excuse us, stay out. You are not allowed to go in. If you do go in, it's an IAC between you and the central government. But the IAC is not there because the central government has requested your help. You are going in. You are helping. And then a week, a month, a year later, central government tells you, we've changed our minds. Thank you very much. You will be mentioned in dispatches. Go home. If you don't go home, this is aggression. Mind you, take a look at the Kampala text, which adopts, as you know, the 1974 General Assembly definition of aggression as a criminal definition. And it specifically says if you remain in the territory of a foreign country beyond the term which has expired of the consent to have you there, this is aggression. So obviously, once you do that, we have an IAC, not an IAC anymore. But once more, events in recent years have shown that there is a certain new dimension, and that is the dimension of a failed state. In a failed state, you do not have a central government. All that you have is organized armed groups fighting each other. So who can issue the invitation? There's no central government. And by definition, only a central government can issue the invitation. Only none remaining, none is capable of issuing the invitation. And then assume, for the sake of argument, that one organized armed group invites one foreign state, and a second organized armed group invites a second foreign state. Both foreign states meet and clash on the territory of the country where there is supposedly only an IAC, And in fact, by then you have an NIAC between these two foreign states. So the more we look into the scenarios of NIAC, the more we realize that they are not as simple as we used to think. I should merely add that besides, add into the equation Security Council binding decisions under Chapter 7, and all bets are off, because the Security Council can do whatever it pleases, provided that we have a resolution adopted under Chapter 7, properly adopted under the Charter of the United Nations, no veto cast. Okay, so much for intervention. Now interaction. First of all, remember, violence continues during an armed conflict. In fact, I would argue that, that violence or crime, maybe I should use the term crime actually increases during an armed conflict because there are so many new crimes. For example, indulging in black market, trading with the enemy. I could go on like this. All sorts of crimes that don't exist in peacetime, but they exist in wartime. So you have to cope with the crimes. How do you cope? I liked very much the suggestion by Gomez Ramirez that you issue a card, blue, red, and the battalion commander decides on Tuesday it's going to be red, Wednesday it's going to be blue, and we behave differently, totally different rules of engagement, totally different body of law. Life is much more complicated, and you have to bear in mind that when we are talking about crime control, I don't know why during this conference the reference has constantly been to human rights law. This is not human rights law. This is criminal law. And criminal law has to be enforced by the police, not by the army. Of course, under different rules altogether. Although sometimes these rules are not more rigid, but they are less rigid than in armed conflict. We mentioned weapons. Remember, in ordinary riot control, you are allowed to use tear gas, non-lethal gas. You are not allowed to use non-lethal gas in any armed conflict, NIAC or IAC, according to the CWC. And even hollow point bullets. So whether they are prohibited only in IAC or both in IAC and in IAC, they are not prohibited in below the threshold situations. In other words, we have two different acts in the same play. And issuing the card will not help us. But then we have a situation where we have both an IAC and an IAC in the same territory. The most obvious example is Afghanistan in October of 2001. There was an IAC in Afghanistan at the time between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. The United States issued an ultimatum and went to war, classical orthodox war against the Taliban in Kabul. The result was that the Northern Alliance was continuing to conduct itself in accordance with NIAC rules, or supposedly continuing to conduct itself in accordance with NIAC rules. The American and Allied troops had, of course, to behave in accordance with IAC rules. Same territory, same, if you wish, coalition, different rules altogether. NIAC and IAC. Then was pointed out in the very revealing presentation by our friend Ferrer from the Philippines, that you can have more than one NIAC in the same territory. I didn't think of it in such clear terms before. And it turns out, actually, when I counted the numbers on the screen, there were 4 of them. I always thought, when I read the newspapers, that Al-Sayaf means exactly the same thing as Moro. No, you have Moro, you have the other wing of Moro, and you have Al-Sayaf. And you have to add to the three of them the communists. So that's four NIACs in the same country. How do they impinge on each other? What happens when moral insurgent means a communist insurgent? Do they shoot upon each other? Do they shake hands and hug? I don't know. But it's a fascinating question. Then you have to bear in mind that, as I mentioned before, there can be a spillover effect to NIAC. The prime example in recent years is the Great Lake region in Africa. So the NIAC in one country creates a NIAC in a neighboring country. Two different NIACs, but interrelated, one caused by the other. You cannot close your eyes to the facts on the ground. Then bear in mind a NIAC can turn into an IAC, with or without an interval. Give you an example. First of all, how does that happen? Apart from the intervention of a foreign state on behalf of the insurgent that I've referred to before. This is where an IAC turns into an IAC, because the foreign state helps the insurgent. But irrespective of that, you have a very common situation of an IAC bringing about an implosion of the state. This is what happened in Bosnia. This is what happened in Eritrea. Now, in Bosnia, there was no interval. In Eritrea, there was an interval. When there is an interval, at least the situation is clearer. Eritrea rebelled against Ethiopia. It established successfully its independence by force of arms. There was an interval, and then Eritrea invades Ethiopia. So before the interval, NIAC. After the interval, IAC. And as you know, there is a commission that has issued already a number of reports on this war, including on the use at bello, not only use in bello. Bosnia, you didn't have the interval. Since you didn't have the interval, the perspective from the level of the battlefield was very baffling. You are a Serbian Bosnian or a Bosnian Serb, however you call him, fighting near Sarajevo. You do not know that Bosnia has declared its independence. You do not know that Germany, within 24 hours, issues recognition, and it's followed by some other European countries. The international community regards Bosnia as independent. It's no longer a part of the former Yugoslavia, it's an independent country. I'm out there on the hill, fighting. I don't necessarily have to be a follower of Mladic or Karadzic. I fight in accordance with the rules. But what rules? The rules of NIAC. It turns out that it's an IAC since 10 o'clock this morning. How am I supposed to know that? Okay, so what I'm saying is when you have an IAC turning into an IAC, situation is not so simple. If that's not enough, an IAC can turn into an IAC. And this is the American position as regards both Iraq and Afghanistan. Started as an IAC in both situations. You establish a new local government. The new local government, whether it's the Maliki government in Baghdad or the Karzai government in Kabul, is recognized by the Security Council in a binding decision. It even gets approval democratically by the voters, however honest and genuine the results of the elections in these two countries were. Now, according to the Americans and the allies, we are therefore no longer in an IAC. We are now in an IAC. The Baghdad government is fighting Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. The Kabul government is fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We are just helping there. We are there by invitation. So it's not an IAC, it's an IAC. Lots of questions here. We discussed some of them last year, actually, in this room on Afghanistan. But what I'm saying is it's not so simple to cope with this problem. Now, if that's not enough, there have been references to recognition of belligerency. Remember, recognition of belligerency is very confusing in this respect, because what it means is not that you are allowed to offer help to a party that you had not been allowed to aid or assist in the past. The reverse is true. If there is recognition of belligerency, that means that the law of neutrality applies as if it were an IAC rather than an NIAC. And under the laws of neutrality, you are not allowed to aid and assist any one of the parties. So this, if you wish, is the other side of the coin compared to what I mentioned earlier about offering recognition of government to the authorities in Benghazi. You offer recognition of government to the authorities in Benghazi, all of a sudden you have a right to assist them in their civil war. You offer recognition of belligerency, not recognition of government, that means I'm no longer allowed to help you because I'm supposed to be neutral. That's the law. And I don't have to tell you that all these distinctions are quite complex. And finally, as I said before, once the Security Council intervenes, all bets are off, because the Security Council can allow you to do what you are not otherwise allowed to do per international law. Why? Because under Articles 25 and 103 of the Charter of the United Nations, the Charter of the United Nations prevails over any other treaty, past or present, and the Security Council resolutions, if adopted under Chapter 7, some claim even under, in certain circumstances, under Chapter 6, but in recent years this is not a reason. Under Chapter 7 are binding. So the Security Council can say you do not have to behave in accordance with the present use in bello. And the Security Council can certainly warp the rules of the jus ad bellum, because it is the policeman of the world, and it so desires, and it got the full carte blanche to do that by the Charter of the United Nations. So to conclude, I already stated in the course of the conference, the law of NIAC is in a flux. We must concede that. And Bill Litzau was right when he said that 10 years ago, if the same conference would have been held, the outlook would have been different. Absolutely right, the outlook of each and every one of us. By the same token, if this conference is reconvened 10 years from now, surely we shall look upon some of the discussions that took place here as, how shall I put it, odd. Because by then the law will change completely. Not every aspect of international law changes all the time. I don't know that the law of diplomatic immunity has budged an inch in the past century or so. But NIAC is different. The law is changing, and we have to change with it. That is to say, to repeat Cicero, times are changing, and so must we. Thank you.